Let's begin with the foundations. Welcome to another lecture. Today we turn our attention to Curaçao, a small island with a large historical footprint and a surprising present. I am Alexei. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, I'm Priyanka, and I'm excited to learn about an island that keeps showing up in trade histories and in travel photos with very colourful waterfronts.
To frame our discussion, Curaçao is a constituent country within the Kingdom of the Netherlands. It sits in the southern Caribbean Sea, about 65 kilometers north of Venezuela. It is part of the ABC Islands, Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao, three Dutch-affiliated islands with semi-arid ecologies and dense connections to the South American mainland. The capital is Willemstad, whose historic core is a UNESCO World Heritage Site anchored by the Schottegat Natural Harbor. It's crucial to understand several terms. First, ABC Islands, a geographic shorthand for Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao, which share climate and history but have distinct constitutional statuses. Second, the Dutch West India Company, a 17th century chartered company that prosecuted war and trade across the Atlantic, and that is to say, administered Curaçao during its formative Dutch era. Third, the Atlantic slave trade, the forced transoceanic movement of enslaved Africans. Curaçao became a transshipment hub in this system from 1662. Finally, free port, a status conferring low customs friction so that goods can be warehoused and re-exported. Curaçao's designation in 1674 helped to turbocharge trade through Willemstad.
So, moving on. Why does this matter now? I think there are at least three stakes. Geopolitically, defence and foreign policy are held at the kingdom level, which shapes how Curaçao navigates regional events in nearby Venezuela and across the Caribbean. Economically, tourism, logistics, and services define the present, while the refinery legacy still frames policy debates. And historically, we are talking about a place that was central to the Atlantic slave trade. Understanding that past informs present identity and memory work on the island. And maybe a common misunderstanding is to treat Curaçao as either just a beach destination or as a little Netherlands. In reality, it is multilingual and very Caribbean, with strong South American ties. And its economy has not been one thing, but several over time.
As we continue, a few basic facts will orient us. Official languages are Papiamento, Dutch, and English. Spanish is widely spoken. Papiamento, a Creole with Iberian and West African roots, is the everyday lingua franca. Dutch predominates in formal administration. English and Spanish are common in commerce and tourism. We observe a recurring economic pattern of pivots. Under Spain, the island was a ranching outpost. Under the Dutch, it became a trade and free port entrepot and a slave trade node. And in the 20th century, it reoriented toward petroleum refining, leveraging Venezuelan crude discovered in 1914. Chronology briefly. In 1499, we have the first recorded European contact via Alonso de Ojeda. In 1634, the Dutch seized the island and founded Willemstad on the Schottegat, then formalized the slave trade role in 1662 and freeport status in 1674. A major slave revolt led by Tula Rigaud and others erupted in 1795, involving thousands and lasting roughly a month before suppression. Fast forward. World War II brought Allied occupations to secure refinery output. In 1954, Curaçao entered the Netherlands Antilles, and in October 2010 it became an autonomous country within the kingdom. In 2020, austerity-related protests turned violent. By contrast, and in a very different register, Curaçao qualified for the 2026 FIFA World Cup, becoming the smallest nation by area and population ever to do so.
Actually, one tiny practical thing. Currency-wise, the Netherlands Antillean guilder still circulates, with the US dollar widely accepted. A Caribbean guilder is designated to replace it, but, implementation has been delayed. Just in case anyone is packing their wallet before they travel.
Speaking of personal motivations, my interest here is methodological. Curaçao is a compact case study in how geography and institutions interact. The island repeatedly reoriented around global trade flows. It is, if you will, a chessboard with a few powerful squares. The Kattegat harbor, the proximity to the Spanish Main, and later the refinery complex. Watching how different players occupied those squares over centuries tells us much about path dependence and choice under constraint. This brings us to three larger questions for today. First, what is the historical significance of the 1795 slave revolt? Second, what if Venezuelan oil had not been discovered in 1914? How might Curaçao have evolved? Third, what are the current environmental challenges linked to the refinery, and what does rigorous evidence tell us so far? Question 1. The 1795 revolt arose from converging pressures: enslaved labor under a commercial trading regime, the spread of Enlightenment and revolutionary ideas, and events in the wider Caribbean. Leaders: Tula Rigaud, Louis Mercier, Bastien Carpata, and Pedro Wacao articulated demands for freedom and improved treatment. Up to 4,000 enslaved people rose, and more than 1,000 engaged in prolonged armed confrontations. Suppression followed after about a month. Reprisals were severe. Yet historically, the episode became a hinge. It rendered visible the contradictions of a free port economy predicated on bondage, and it seeded discourse that would, over decades, shape emancipation-era expectations and later civic claims.
I'm curious about how that episode lives in the present. Can we say that the revolt directly shaped modern Curaçaoan identity? Or is it more that later movements reinterpreted it to speak to their own moment?
It is worth noting that memory is iterative. The revolt is commemorated as a foundational event. In education and public culture, it functions as an anchor for narratives of dignity and resistance. After 1969's uprising over labor, race, and governance, one sees a reframing of official and vernacular history. Afro-Curaçaoan political influence expanded, Papiamento's prominence rose, and the 1795 revolt served as a historical mirror to think about justice and representation within the kingdom framework. So its influence is both primary, as a real 18th century rupture, and secondary, as a symbol mobilized in successive waves of reform.
That makes sense. Building on that, can we maybe now look at the counterfactual? If Venezuelan oil had not been discovered in 1914, what were the plausible paths for Curaçao's economy? I often think about whether tourism and finance would have developed earlier, or if the island would have struggled without that industrial anchor.
Let's transition to another aspect. Without nearby cheap crude and the incentives of vertical integration by majors like Shell, Curaçao likely would have doubled down on its comparative advantages that predate oil. The deep protected Kattegat harbor, free port experience, and ship repair capacities suggest a logistics and transshipment specialization. Finance and business services often follow such nodes. Tourism would have developed along two niches: cultural heritage centered on Willemstad's urban ensemble, and marine recreation featuring leeward side reefs, drop-offs close to shore, and Klein Curaçao's long strand. An underappreciated asset, the upwelling-driven marine climate, could have anchored health and wellness tourism, allied to diving and year-round outdoor sports.
But is a diversified port tourism finance mix really feasible for a small island without the oil rents? Maybe it would have faced even stronger outmigration in the late 20th century.
To some extent, yes, constraints would have bitten. Small markets and exposure to shocks do not disappear in the absence of oil. However, geography is stubborn. Proximity to the South American mainland, multilingual human capital, and a UNESCO-listed capital together constitute a robust platform. We can infer that scale would have been smaller, and volatility would have arrived via different channels, shipping cycles and tourism demand rather than oil prices. But a viable, diversified economy is plausible. Indeed, the post-1985 period after Shell's exit and the symbolic one-guilder sale to a local consortium forced partial movement in that direction, even with refinery operations leased to PDVSA. On to our next point, the environmental question. Historically, a refinery-centered economy delivered employment and connectivity while externalizing certain costs. Lawsuits have alleged that sulfur dioxide and particulate emissions have exceeded safety standards. Regulators and courts have at times mandated mitigation. The precise degree of exceedance is contested in litigation and can vary with meteorology and the monitoring regime. Thus, we must be careful to distinguish assertion from adjudicated fact. Beyond air quality, researchers have hypothesized ecological losses, such as possible disappearance of subterranean aquatic fauna since the 1970s. Causality is not definitively established, but the signal deserves rigorous study in a small island with limited buffers.
What about recent solutions or initiatives? Are there credible pathways that balance jobs, public health, and the environment, and maybe also reduce the exposure to Venezuela's volatility that came with the PDVSA lease?
In this context, options generally fall into three families. First, modernization under strict emissions controls. Cleaner fuels, desulfurization, continuous monitoring, and community disclosure regimes aligned with international norms. Second, partial repurposing of the industrial site toward less polluting maritime functions. Green ship repair, logistics, and energy storage, paired with staged remediation. Third, gradual energy diversification. Wind and solar are not panaceas, but they can reduce local combustion while exploring regional interconnections and storage. Oversight mechanisms linked to kingdom debt relief provide fiscal guardrails. Yet execution capacity, transparent contracting, and longitudinal health studies are the binding constraints. Research needs are clear: a comprehensive airshed model, groundwater and coastal hydrology mapping, and cohort-based public health assessments tied to exposure histories. These would turn debate into quantifiable trade-offs.
And, just to round that out, protecting charismatic species and places, like sea turtle nesting sites in Boca or flamingo flats, also intersects with tourism quality. So the environment here is not just a constraint. It is an asset to be managed wisely.
In simpler terms, good environmental governance is economic policy by another name on a small island.
So I guess that kind of sums it up. Curaçao is an autonomous country in the Dutch Caribbean, anchored by Willemstad and a long history of trading, speaking multiple languages and adapting to global shifts.
To summarize, we examined three questions. The 1795 revolt as a foundational episode with a long cultural and political afterlife. A counterfactual path without oil, emphasizing logistics, heritage, and marine tourism. And the present refinery challenge, where evidence-based choices about modernization, repurposing, and diversification are paramount. For further study, consider Curaçao's role within the broader Dutch Caribbean architecture, how shared sovereignty, financial oversight, and regional proximity shape choices across the ABC Islands.
Thank you for listening, and thank you, Alexei.
This then completes our present analysis. Until next time.